Welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully. This is a podcast to elevate teacher voice. In this program, you will hear teachers sharing their journey into this profession and their ideas for education. I'm kicking it off Teacher Appreciation Week, which starts May 2nd. This is about honest, vulnerable, inspiring storytelling. It's a time and a space for teachers to share their ideas for the future of education. Teachers are beautiful beings who give their heart and soul to their community. They're innovators, they're inspirational, not only to children, but to the people around them. And they deserve to share their voice. So welcome to The Teacher's Story. Enjoy. Hi, welcome to The Teacher's Story. I'm Jackie Scully, and today we have Peter Berg with us. Dr. Peter Berg, he has his EDD. He is an author with the book, The Tao of the Teenager, A Guide to Teen Health, Happiness, and Empowerment, an adjunct faculty at Southern New Hampshire University, school leader, teen mental health coach, and alternative education organizer with the organization AERO, Alternative Education Resource Organization, which I am very excited to learn more about today. So thank you, Peter, for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
My first question for you is, what was your initial inspiration to get into education? Was it something from your early years or later in your adult years?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. And for me, it was something I knew that I was always going to do, even though I tried to resist it. I think, as most young people, you have aspirations of, being a professional baseball player or, et cetera, things like that. And so I think I always knew I was going to end up in some sort of helping profession, and definitely knew that I was going to be a teacher in some fashion. I just didn't know what it would look like. And I think really what the thing that really kind of brought it all together for me and really made it something where I knew it was something I was going to pursue, whenever that happened. I was during actually an eighth grade lesson on the Holocaust, and I just remember, that particular teacher was a very dynamic teacher, and but I think it was just the way he approached that. And believe it or not, he had the whole eighth grade class together for like 3 hours, which was like kind of a big deal to be able to do that. And I think it was just his approach, and I think he just didn't hold anything back. And I found that very profound and very moving. And I think it was something that he said at the end too, where he said, if this makes you sick to your stomach, make sure this never happens again. And so, of course, me being the person I was, I raised my hand and said, well, how do we do that? And he said, well, help people you have no reason to help. Smile, be kind, help when you can. And I think that really stuck with me. And that, even though I didn't know it at the time, and it wasn't like at that moment, I just, the light, opened up and I had this great epiphany. I think though it was impactful. And I think that really made an impact on me. And that's something that I wanted to share with other people. So, and then I became a New York City public school teacher, did that for a number of years. And I think as I was doing that, I just realized that there was more to this. And even in my undergraduate training, as a teacher, I was lucky enough to have professors who really kind of thought outside the box and looked at education as a whole and a holistic endeavor. And then I came across a man by the name of John Taylor Gatto, who has been passed away for a few years now, but he was a New York City public school teacher as well for many years, about 30 years, I believe. But was a little bit of a renegade or a responsible subversive, and did things where, he would get, students out of the building and they would do internships and things like that. So I think just hearing about that and, having that kind of, I think just all of those things coming together. And then way back when I was a student teacher, I was in kind of an alternative program, and I was really an assistant teacher in the classroom. It was a small classroom of mixed age students, and students who just needed a different kind of environment. And the lead teacher happened to have kind of an out of a blue medical emergency, and it became my classroom. And I was about
Wow.
a month and a half into student teaching, with students who, let's just say I think the conventional system didn't really work for
Yeah.
them. And so I think what that did for me is really drive home this idea of relationships with students, and how, education is so much more than just, going and talking about information.
Mhm.
It's so much more than that. And I think that just really, and it also resonated with me in a big way. And I think that just really kind of shaped the rest of my life, really. I mean, all of those things coming together really just shaped what I was going to do.
Wow. So impactful. And I want to first touch on your teacher in high school or in middle school, and then this work you did as a student teacher. And I have a kind of connection with that with a guest I had on earlier this season. But I'm a history teacher, so that resonated with me. I had really impactful history teachers in middle school as well that kind of brought history to life. I remember doing like this really neat Native American project and learning about the local Native American groups in like the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York area. But just talking about the Holocaust, like when you can present a message that's deeper than just here is something that happened in history that we're going to learn about. And maybe, you do tell stories or have a guest speaker. It's funny, I have a guest speaker that talks about her mom as a Holocaust survivor coming into my classroom this week. So it's interesting having this conversation. But the message of having empathy, being there for people, seeing, all people as equal and wanting to help strangers and help people you normally wouldn't. I think that's what stays with students, stays with you. And it's really powerful when you are now an adult and you can remember this exact message from 8th grade,
Mhm.
and I think many people have at least one teacher in their life that has some message that they sent to them and they can hold on to that. And that's kind of why I got into it and why I stayed into it, is that you can have that impact, and there you can have a negative impact too. So like the responsibility you have as a teacher, it's powerful. It's really important that you are sending that, really positive message to those students, because they'll remember the negative ones too.
Mhm.
Um, the student teaching piece, I had a former student on this season who is now a teacher, and same thing. It was during the pandemic, height of the pandemic. Her teacher that she was working with got really sick, and they're like, it's now your classroom, and you're 21 years old, you're just getting your feet wet,
Mhm.
and an emergency happens, and they need someone. And that's the learning experience,
Yes.
right? You really can you tell me more about, because we'll get into the work you do in alternative education, like what that early experience was like, or like what the alternative education setting was like at that time?
Yeah, so it was a setting within a public school setting, but it was really a cohort that kind of traveled together. Not for every single class, but for most of them. And so I think really what it was there was some recognition there that, okay, this isn't working for this group of students.
Mhm.
What can we do? Can we do something different? Now, as we all know, sometimes with big systems, they resist change, I guess, is the way to say it, right? I think it was really that recognition that these students needed something different, and that there was a way to try this and do
Mhm.
something differently, and I think, on to be 100% honest, as I reflected back, later on, when I really started to think about it, unfortunately, I think some of it was like, well, we need to do something with them. And so what did we do? And it wasn't necessarily born out of this kind of altruistic,
Mm,
let's do what we can to help them. I think there was some of that, but unfortunately, I think that was the lesser piece. I think the bigger piece was like, okay, well, you know, they're being disruptive in other classes and they're not doing well and they're whatever. And so what did we do? And I think it kind of started with, okay, let's kind of get them out of sort of the, I won't even call it mainstream because they were mainstreamed, but let's get them out of these other settings and put them all together kind of thing.
mhm,
Um, and so again, I mean, I think it was kind of born from that, but I think out of that came some really interesting things. And I think for me, that whole experience was just about, like you were talking about, touching the student's heart, right? Making that emotional connection. And I think what these students really wanted, and I think when I really think back, it was probably like the first, 4 or 5 months where a lot of what we did was just really connecting with each other. And yes, we
mm,
learned some things and we talked about things, and we did things. But I think it was really more about a lot of these students didn't have trust for adults
mm,
and they had really bad experiences with adults and with education. And I think there was a lot there. So this was a high school. So I have most of my experiences middle school, high school, and of course, college age as well. Um, but so this is with high school students, and I think by the time they got to high school, they were just, they had some really bad experiences
mm,
with school, and I think that was a lot of the work was around that, just kind of like, all right, we actually have this opportunity, and to
mhm,
really look at it like that rather than this is a punishment, this is really an opportunity.
mm,
And
mhm,
I don't know. I shouldn't say I do know. I think they guided me more than I guided them, right?
mhm,
Because I think even though I maybe helped them phrase things and kind of like, frame some stuff, I think it was really more what they were saying to me was really about, and as a young teacher and someone coming out of, and doing student teaching, I think it was more about, okay, they're telling me this is what they need, so I should listen, right? Uh,
yes,
and so and I did, and I think, there was some success there. I think me deciding to not stay with public school teaching was a variety of factors. I think one, I to be honest, I just wanted to experience different things. I
mm,
think that was part of it. And I kind of, I after trying to affect change and do things differently, and some really interesting experiences in terms of the structure and what that structure can and can't do. And then I just realized that there's some other things out there, and there's different ways to do this. And so I really wanted to experience that. And which kind of leads me to the things that I'm doing now, which are multiple things, but yeah.
yeah. And this whole path of alternative education being like at first like the other way of doing education, or I think of when I was in high school, like the VOTech program was the other, where like the kids who don't want to do the traditional academic route, they go and they do the VOTech route. And there was something always about that's less than,
Mhm.
where I think the new kind of way of looking at it, and maybe what you'll explain a little bit more with AERO, is that it's not just other, or because the students are not really doing well in the traditional classroom, is like maybe the traditional classroom is not really the way we should be educating our kids, and these students are really picking up on something about being more authentically themselves, and maybe also having that sense of agency of this is not working for me and I need more exploration, I need more get me out in the field, like get me using my hands and talking to people in a field I'm interested in, learning real skills that are going to benefit me as an adult in the real world, and not just like all these essays I have to write or like all these tests I have to take. And for some students that still works, but I think long-term, the traditional system is breaking down. I mean, just in general, the public school system is breaking down because we have teachers leaving. We have, students really struggling to have good mental health, like struggling with anxiety. A lot of this is coming out of the pandemic, but I'm sure they were struggling with that before. And we're seeing that there needs to be more support system in the school. And it's not just about taking all these classes and getting this GPA and passing all these tests. And I think it worked for a while, but even into the 21st century, I do feel like it's kind of breaking down. And this opening of, and that's why I really enjoy having you on the show, is talking about these different ways of learning, I think needs to be explored. And I think it needs to be infused in the public school system, because long-term, that traditional method, it's just not the way we're functioning as humans anymore, right? Like a lot of it is, we want it to control and compartmentalize like all of these subjects and put students into like a box and say, this is your job track. This will funnel into industry or into whatever we need you for in society. And it was just, I guess, like a way to just have a system, right? And now it's like, well, we want to have students thrive as people, right? We want to have people thrive as people and know who they are and what they have passion for, and how they can make a living off of that too, be practical in that way. So if you want to tell me a little bit more about the work you're doing in alternative education and, all of your different projects that you have.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So a lot of what I'm doing now is for AERO, which is the Alternative Education Resource Organization. AERO has been around for over 30 years. And so really, in a nutshell, the mission is to bring learner-directed education opportunities to everyone, to make it accessible to everyone. And so within that, AERO is inclusive of really anybody who's interested in that. So that goes, from Montessori to homeschooling to unschooling to public school to, to really anything, anybody who's interested in that idea that it is learner directed, right? Learner directed, learner centered. And, humans are natural learners. And, one thing when I do talks like this, and sometimes with groups who are maybe initially resistant, because when they hear my background, they hear what I represent, they think that it's kind of bashing everything that they're doing. And one question I ask them is, so when you're interested in learning something, does someone have to loom over you to make you do it and then coerce, threaten, negotiate with you to do it? And the answer is always no, right? If I'm interested, that doesn't need to happen. So I think this model of education that we have, where it's like, okay, I need to tick all these boxes. And like you were saying earlier, for some students that works. And at certain times they might be interested in those things. And maybe, it's introduced to them and they didn't know they were interested, but now they are interested. I think that's okay, but it has to be learner directed. It has to be directed by, okay, what are you interested in? Well, let's talk about the things that you're interested, that connect with you, that have that emotional connection. And you were talking about just a bit ago about this kind of real world, real life experience that I think, everyone craves, right? Everyone wants that. They want to see how they want to interact with people, right? Or they want to interact with the real world in a real way. That's not to say that school can't be real. I mean, yes, that's real, right? It's part of society. We go to school, we interact with each other. There's a lot of important things that happen there. But I think it gets so segmented because it's around, grades and test scores and this kind of compulsory, you have to go. And I think that's not working anymore. I don't know that it ever really did. And when I mentioned John Taylor Gatto, he has a book about really about how the education system here, at least in this country, started. And it's not always a pretty picture, in terms of where it came from and the origins of it and what was it supposed to be about. Now, that being said, I want to just take a really quick and important pause here to say there are, millions of people in the public school education system that are doing great work, that are, extraordinary people that, that really care, that want to do this right. And I think part of it though is there's a bigger system there that it's hard, it's hard for it to change because it is so big. And there are some things that they do well. So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
what do we change? What are the pieces that we change? And for me, I would say do away with grading, do away with the compulsory nature of you have to go to school. And I think even just, putting people together by age, right? Like, where else in the world does that happen? It doesn't, right? There's nowhere else where everybody is segregated just by age. That's it. That's the only criteria. There is no, I want to learn this, or I've already learned this 2 years ago, or, or whatever, right? It's this kind of age grouping idea that, again, I think, doing away with that compulsory and making it really, learner directed. And there's ways to do that, even with, a class of 35 students, there are ways to do that. But it does take kind of a reshifting and a rethinking. And so a lot of the work we do with AERO is, one is to help students and families find the right fit, what's going to work for them. And it really, it's just across the board. There's not one thing that we recommend. It's like, okay, tell us about what's going on. Okay, where are you, geographically? And then, what are some of the things you can look into? And that's one of the main things that we do. And then we also put on events, which I guess we'll talk about in a minute. And we do that, we do trainings, we help people start, schools or learning environments or that kind of thing. And again, it's not about, we're never wants to get up there and say, the conventional system or the public school system or whatever term people are using is evil. We're not that. We're not those people. We're saying it needs to change. And there are things to really take a hard look at, because one of the things that you said a little bit ago is you were talking about some damage that could be done, in a system that I think is geared more towards a top down, kind of idea. And there is damage, and students can be wounded by school. And I'm a mental health practitioner as well. And a lot of what I see, we talk about, okay, what's one of the first questions I talk about is, what's school like for you? What are you doing? Where are you learning? And tell me about that environment. And a lot of the anxiety and the stress comes from, environments that are not learner directed or learner centered. They're not, they're centered on other things, but not that. And I think there's a real important discussion to be had, and there's some really important action to be taken. Now, I agree with what you were saying a bit ago about we still need a strong public school system, because I think what we find is in some right with alternatives is, there's often a fee, right? I mean, it's not free to go. And now some people will say, well, what about ESAs and what about the money following the child? Well, that's certainly a model, and I think that it is an important one, and I think it's a really important idea. But I also think the public school system is, there's room there for this to change and to be what it needs to be. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of resistance, and I think it's, unfortunately, I think when we talk about alternatives sometimes is that could also be manipulated too, right? That can be turned into, I was actually reading an article, I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, or maybe just last week, how and there was a homeschooling group that was really about, learning how to be good Nazis, and I hate to say that, but that's what it was. And so, yeah, there's certainly things like that could happen. I think we run the risk though of like looking at that and saying that's what all of it is, and it's not. It really isn't. In fact, it's most of it is the antithesis of that, and really talking about again being a self-directed and self-determinant, and understanding how you fit into the community, and that you're an important part of the community. It's not just sometimes when I say learner directed, it can sound like it's all selfish and it's all about what the learner wants, and yeah, in a large way it is, but it's also learning about, okay, what's my place, right? How do I fit into this? What am I about? Who am I? Totally different way of going about it. And so there's a lot of interest now, as you were saying. Like, I think the pandemic, some of the silver lining there was that people's eyes were opened. I think there were like different methods of that had to be employed, right? Like, I think even if we look at the conventional system, there was remote learning, which, whether it was a disaster or whether it worked, it was still like, hey, this is something different, right? It's just different. There's another way to possibly do this. Some schools had classes outside, right? And they made use of their space. And so I think that was it in a way, really encouraged people to think outside the box and like, okay, what do we do? How do we do this? And can we do this well? And what's a different way? And for some students, I think they found, what, I like this remote learning.
They did.
And I don't have to be in school every day. Maybe I can go a couple of days a week, or maybe. And so I think it really just took this all and shook it up and turned it upside down and all of that, and was like, okay, what can we really do here? And I think, to me, that's the future. I mean, we're going into, I can tell you, I mean, there are people starting micro schools, and I mean, it's just happening. People and parents are now, and students, right, and learners are saying, look, what I'm doing now doesn't really work. This doesn't really, this isn't really an interest of mine. And so what do I do? How can I do something meaningful? And I think we're all searching for that meaning, right? Like, what's meaningful?
Yeah, and that's like all wrapped up into like kind of like my next part when I talk about the pandemic. So I think it is a time where we are shaking things up and becoming more honest with ourselves. Students are very honest. Like, I have a pretty good rapport. I teach high school, and I'm actually doing a unit right now, my psychology class, on learning. So I kind of use them as like my little like study, and like ask them, like, tell me what you've learned during this time in the pandemic, of what's working, what's not working. Maybe flexibility works. Like, I know a lot of students, they didn't like being virtual all the time, but they liked that we had this one period of time where we had Wednesdays called asynchronous days. So Monday, Tuesday virtual, Thursday, Friday virtual, but just to give us a break of not being on Zoom all day, we had async days, and the students can just work on the things they were given on the other days. And they could also, then we had office hours for meeting on Zoom. So you want to meet for a half hour with your teacher on Zoom on that Wednesday. It was beautiful. And it was like some breathing room for all of us. And I'm like, why can't we still build in something like that? Like, I teach high school. They're young adults. I talk to them like young adults. This isn't a daycare, and like school, like you were saying, it shouldn't be like compulsory. Like, it's not daycare. It's not childcare. I mean, I feel like a lot of times it's still seen that way. Like, I just need to put my kids somewhere.
Right.
But if we can teach kids to be more independent, to work on their own, and give them autonomy, give them choice, ask them like what they want to learn about, give them something with structure, and then go and do it. Like, a lot of them can do that on their own, and then they can manage the time how they want to do it. So a lot of them liked that. And I feel like we can take that with us into this new time. So kind of thinking about the public school system, and I'm very much an advocate of let's break down the system and try to change it and shake it up. But I think you got to do it in pieces. It's so big. There's
Mhm.
so many holes. My biggest area is the schedule. Like, I think scheduling, it is so packed, and they start school so early. Like, I'm fortunate, I'm in an independent school, and we start it now at 8:30, which is
Mhm.
reasonable. Many of the high schools start at 7:30 in the morning. I used to be in school at 6:45 in the morning. That
Mhm.
is not the way we function as humans at
Yeah.
all, especially teenagers. Like, you look at all the
Mhm.
stuff on child development and their brain and sleep and all of that. And we're not following the psychological science with how we do school. Like, that needs to be matching. Like, we need to be using child development and psychology and pairing that with how we do school. And
Yeah.
schedules don't work. And the fact that they have one class 40 minutes or 45, move to the next one, and it's like subject here, subject, nothing's cohesive. There's no time to process. You're
Mhm.
literally just moving kids around for control and structure and packing it in because we need to cover all this stuff. No, we don't.
Yeah.
Why,
Right.
why are we still thinking we have to cover all this stuff? And if it goes back to higher ed, if you're looking at it's still a college driven system, then we need to
Mhm.
look at that too. Like, not everything should be about you end up in college. And
Mhm.
also, higher ed needs to be more flexible. Like, why do they need all these credits in this subject, and this subject? They
Right.
don't. Like, that doesn't make you a well-rounded learner because you
Right.
have 4 credits in each subject area.
Right.
And I think you can start to manipulate the schedule. Like, start with one thing, open it up a little bit, maybe start later, have some space in the day where it's just you have time to work on a project, you have time to meet with teachers, right? We should be there guiding them and not just like, I'm literally teaching you a subject. I don't think they should have as many classes in a day. You don't have that in college. You might have 2 or 3. Why do we have 8 classes in a day? That's ridiculous. Like, it's just jam packed. I see kids eating lunch in the hallway. I've done this the same. 20 minutes to get to the next thing, to get to a meeting during lunch. I'm like, that's, our body doesn't function that way. Like, we're not meant to just be on a conveyor belt. Like, school feels like a conveyor belt for
Mhm.
sure. We need to have space. And that's also a place where you can have creativity, problem solving, thinking deeply, and having these deeper conversations like you had with your teacher about the Holocaust, right? 3-hour lesson program, right? Because there was space that teacher created for that. Like, we can start there. And that's something I'm really passionate about. I'm trying to kind of infuse that a little bit within my own school because we're small and we're independent. And so, like, just in my own little micro level, like, okay, what could we start to manipulate with the schedule? Like, we do have a place where faculty can give feedback about the schedule and things that we would like to see. So little by little, there's some of that there, but I think on the public school system level, because it is so massive, nobody knows where to start.
Mhm.
And I'm like, why don't we just start with looking at how we can tweak schedules, like something,
Yeah.
and having a place where there's just a little bit more downtime. The kids will be okay. They
Mhm.
will be fine. You can give them some space.
Well, play, right? Play is super important.
Yeah.
And like what you were describing is so unhealthy, just from every aspect, mental health, physical health, emotional health, all that is completely unhealthy. Again, nowhere else in the world does that happen. Nowhere, no, in no other space in society does that happen. And so even when we look at, I teach college students, all the way from undergrad up to the doctoral level. In general, right? You're starting from the beginning anyway, right? In general, you're making sure everyone has kind of a similar understanding. So if someone coming out of high school doesn't know everything about whatever, class they're in, well, you're not really expecting them to do that. Even at the graduate level, even above, I mean, are there certain things that you would expect people to know? Sure, but you're still also starting from that common understanding, and you develop that. So I think when people, and, oh, well, they have to be ready for college. I think there's yes, I mean, there was college driven, and I think there's some of that, but I think to really understand, it's not about necessarily knowing all this background information. It's about knowing yourself well as a learner and understanding how you learn and what kind of information you can take in, and making connections that help you understand the material and help you connect with it. That is way more important than the whatever background knowledge we're trying to stuff into learners' brains. It just doesn't work that way. And there's you were talking about scheduling and all of that, and I see high school students waiting for the bus at 6 a.m. and it's dark out, and it's like, what's that about? Because we know all we know, we're still doing that. And I think what that says is that in a lot of ways the system is adult centered, not so much youth centered. And look, obviously adults are part of it, so we have to take care of the adults as well, I think, but we have to take care of each other. We have to take care of everybody in the system, and or everybody that's part of this, right? So there's I think there's a lot of space to do things and to change things. I think what we're seeing though is a lot of people are just leaving, right? They're just like, I yes, I have all these ideas. Yes, I think probably this can happen, but you know what? I have my child has only 4 more years of high school. This is not going to change in 4 years, or it's not going to change significantly enough to really make a difference. A lot of what we're talking about, this self-directed idea, has to really, it obviously it's way better if it starts earlier, like and even in the home, in terms of parenting, right? There's just these models of really giving students giving youth and children agency, and this idea of having choices and making decisions. We have this model where at 4 or 5 years old you go into the system, and then at 17 or 18 you graduate from the system, but throughout that whole time you had very little opportunity to make decisions. And then magically when you graduate, you're supposed to be really good at making decisions, right?
That's
like
so true.
Oh, I wonder why when students get to college, maybe, and they have freedom for the first time and they have to make decisions, no one's going to, run them down in college and say, hey, how come you weren't in class, right? Like that doesn't really happen. So all of a sudden they have this freedom. They're not really used to it, and they don't always make, the greatest decisions. Now that can be no matter what, right? You can grow up self-directed and still not make good decisions. But the thing is we're not even allowing that, or like giving them opportunity to make real choices, to say, okay, if I choose this, then this might be the outcome. If I choose that might be the outcome. And to really experience that. And I don't know, to me, there's such an opportunity you can do that with a safety net. Because once you graduate, right? And I say graduate in air quotes because, this is kind of this arbitrary thing, but, once you sort of move on and you're considered an adult because you're a certain age or whatever, there isn't really that much of that safety net anymore. There's some, right? But not in the same way. And so why not have students make these decisions and have this opportunity and be, self-directed. And it's not always easy to be self-directed. I think as humans, sometimes we just want somebody to say, just go do that, right?
Yes.
We don't necessarily want to think through everything like that, but there's room in that for that, right? There's places for that. And I think when you're self-directed and you have that model, you understand the need sometimes for that. You understand that, look, if this room is on fire and someone knows the way out, I want them to tell me where to go, not, hey, let's sit around and decide what the best way is to go, right? So I think, but because you have that system, and then a lot of what we do at AERO too is we talk about democratic process, and it's not, teaching kids to be Democrats, right? It's, democratic process, right? And so So that's super important. And that's something that it so can be done in, in any system. And there's a gentleman by the name of Yaakov Hecht, and he's out of Israel. And he actually, in the public schools in Israel, actually have this democratic process, largely because of the work that he's done with the public school system there. And yes, it can happen. And I go to a school with 6,000 students. Okay, and I get it. That's big, right? But there's still ways to do democratic process, and it isn't all that. I mean, when I say it isn't, democracy can be messy sometimes, right? Because of gathering all the voices and kind of making decisions. But there's also the model of the Iroquois Confederacy, right? Like that model of democracy where everybody's voice is represented, right? Even if there's a vote and whatever, and then you have maybe a small number of people who were, I hate this phrase, but I can't think of anything else, like voted against, right? Or they didn't get their what they wanted wasn't voted for. But there's still ways to represent that voice, and that's what the Iroquois Confederacy did really well. And I think there's lessons there, that we can take. So it's not just about, okay, well, 50 people decided this and 49 wanted that, so we don't worry about the 49 people, right? It's like, well, that's not really going to work, right?
Right.
So, and I think we honestly, in some ways, we see that politically going on, on a bigger scale, where some people just feel like they're not represented well, but I think that's shifting. And I think what I see is the positive right now is people are feeling very free to express their voices. And whether I agree with them or not is not even the point, right? Is they're expressing their voices. Now, that's a whole other conversation that we probably don't have time for with this, but I think, when we see all of these things coming together, so being self-directed, learner-directed, having a democratic process, doing away with things like, when I say do away with grades, I don't mean not having any feedback or not getting, being mentored or, understanding that process. But, you put a grade on a paper and it doesn't hold it. There's value, I guess, in the sense that, okay, you got this out of this. But the idea is, okay, but what's the feedback? What do I do? How do I improve this? What happened? What was going on? What was I thinking at the time? Like all of that, I think that is a very different model than what we have. And it not being compulsory, because I think once you do that, when you force it, it just takes a very, so I think, and I've talked to lots of teachers. When I said that, I said, so what do you think would happen if students were showing up because they wanted to show up? What would that reduce for you? What would that open up for you in terms of time and just the way you're thinking, and so that students are interested, okay? That they're there because they're whether it's a topic you're covering, whatever, but they're interested, right? They want to, they're choosing to come. What would that open up for you? And there's a lot. And then I just wanted to, because you raise an important point about, well, what do I do with my child kind of idea, right? And that's so if like we don't have this school system, where do my children go while I'm working during the day? And that is real. That is a really important and true and realistic, concern and thought. But again, I think there are ways to do that where, learners are going to a place that's honoring who they are, right? And wants to make them, or just give them space, right? To just be who they are. We talked about play, how important play is. How many, schools are really set up for that, to understand the importance of play, and especially at a young age. I mean, play is important for everybody, adults, all the way up to, play is important, but like how many learning environments in the conventional system are really set up for that? Now, some of them are definitely adopting that and recognizing that, and there are really good things happening. I think it's just, it's kind of like we're almost like tinkering around, you know, we're kind of
Mm.
moving, we're trying to find what's going on, and it's hard to let go of something that we all know, and we all like, it's right, it's ingrained into the fabric of
Yeah,
our society. It really is, right? I mean, think about driving in the morning and not seeing any school buses, right? I
right,
mean,
right.
what do you mean there's no
Yeah.
school, right? Like, and it's just
It's
ingrained.
great in the summertime. I love it.
Right. Oh yeah, because you can get around, right? Like
Yeah, the traffic is way less.
yeah, oh absolutely. No, and
Everyone hates September.
right. Yeah, it's true, isn't it? And I think it's interesting because I think when I think about it and I see, okay, so there's a student that has to travel 45 minutes on a bus, right? And then get off this bus, go into this assist, right? So, and you know, some people say, well, people commute to work. Yeah, of course they do. Okay, granted, right? But this student is being forced to do that, right? You're
Mhm.
making a choice, right? You can choose, right? To a large degree, right? People have choice in, okay, how far do I have to commute, right? Now, the thing is so we need more. To me, I think we
Mhm.
need more learning environments, right?
Yeah.
And we need to kind of and the you know it more community learning
Mhm.
and like you were talking, maybe the model is, you know, they don't go every day, but they go two days a week, 3 days a week, whatever it is. The other days they're, you know, doing um you know, projects in their community, or they're learning, you know, and so to me
Mhm.
it's taking out that factor of, you know, this just the stress of getting out of the door in the morning
Mhm.
and being on time so that bus picks you up, you know, that's stressful. I mean, I talk to a lot of students about that, and it's just like that sort of starts the day in this kind of
Yeah.
like, you know,
It
this
starts the day of
anxiety,
like, it's a sludge,
right? And it's like
Yeah.
this anxiety mode because if you're
Yeah.
not up at a certain time and you're not out the door at a certain time and you miss the bus, right? That creates a whole cascade of things usually. Now, some kids just don't go, right? It's like, all right, whatever. I missed the bus,
Yeah.
um, but if they're, you know, if they're wanting to get there, then either they have to, you know, have a parent or someone else take them or make other arrangements. And so it's, you know, there's a lot of things there that I think we really need to examine. We really need to understand that there are a lot of options out there.
Mhm.
So, you know, anybody who listens to this, I hope one thing to take away is that there are other things, there are
Mhm.
other options out there, but there's also lots of ways to really affect change, you know, in the current environment that you're in. And I'm talking to students as well. I mean, students,
Mhm.
you have a lot of power with your voice. You know, your voice carries a lot of weight, and you know, it's okay to ask for things, and it's okay to
Yeah.
say this isn't working. And it's okay to, you know, to organize around that
I
idea and to
think
say,
so.
we want change and this is what we want, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this is why, not just because we're like, well, we just want to hang around and like, you know,
Right.
whatever, even though that's important too, right? Like that idea of, you know, having that downtime and having those open times and to be able to, you know, interact and, dare I say, maybe get into trouble, you know, and like get yourself out of it, right? Kind of idea.
Well, make your
Uh,
mistakes in
right,
secondary level because that's when the stakes are a little lower.
right. And
Right.
that's exactly true, right? I think to understand that and to experience those things, I mean, to say, okay, I chose that and that happened. Okay, what was going on? What was my thinking? Okay, if I'm faced with this another time, what might I do differently? Or would I do
Yeah.
the same thing? And why? And I think that is so important. And there's resiliency in there, and there's, you know, there's that agency and there's that understanding. And I think to say this, sometimes when I talk to people about this, someone like, well, there's no accountability. I'm like, no, this is the opposite. This is
Mhm.
actually in some ways more accountability,
Mhm.
because you're realizing, you understand, right, that choices have outcomes and you can choose things, right, but understand that it, you know, it sets you down a road. And so there's actually at some level even more accountability
For
and
sure.
more understanding, right,
Yeah.
of
When it's your choice, it's your consequence as well, good or
right,
bad. So you own that, and that's your accountability. And like, the whole saying, like, life's your greatest teacher. It really is. Like, I learned more as a young and middle-aged adult than I ever did in school. you know? So when you give space and agency for students to kind of figure it out, and they're going to stumble and they're going to make mistakes, they're going to hold on to that. And then when they're 20 years old and, you know, moving into their life completely independent from their parents, they're going to have more confidence. They're going to be like, yeah, I can do this because I've stumbled before. I figured it out before. I have that kind of problem solving muscle of like, okay, when I messed up before, when I did it this way before, what do I remember? Okay, what am I going to do next time? But if we're planning everything out for them and holding their hand so tight, literally pre-K through 12th grade, that's why you see freshmen going into college still like acting like it's 13th year, you know? And I've had graduate professors in my graduate program tell me about like, this is back, you know, in a while ago, but even back like 6 years ago, I have parents calling me and like asking about, you know, getting an extension. I'm like,
Right.
you're not part of this conversation. They're 18 now. That's all confidential. Like, you're not part of this
Right.
conversation.
Yes.
And so that hand holding and having to do everything for them, make all of their choices, including classes you're going to take, assignments you're going to do, all of that, they're setting up for failure, because then when they're a young adult, they're like, how do I make decisions on my own? Because all of these adults made decisions for me my whole life. And I do think we need to just be like, as adults in the system, okay with loosening the reins. Like, we can loosen the reins a little bit. They're not going to go like bonkers. Maybe some of them, and you got to keep an eye on them.
Sure.
But when you loosen the reins a little bit, and you give them that autonomy and that sense of agency, and like, I will be here to guide you, but maybe from a distance, most of the time they're going to do okay. You know, they're going to do okay. And I do like this idea of, with your organization, AERO, of giving a lot of different types of learning environments. And I would like to see more choice in the way that we have learning environments throughout our country, and that it's funded. Like, it would be great that the taxes we go towards public school, we could also have a way to fund different educational programs, because there isn't a one size fits all. Everybody learns differently, and having these different programs, but there's funding there, at least maybe for having some kind of more of a grant scholarships that go thrown into it for students who want to go into those programs. That would be great. Because I think a lot of times too, it does come down to, well, this is free, I don't want to pay for this, even though this might work better for my child, you know? So I think it goes back to funding too.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it's like the idea of the money follows the child, right? And it's funny, like I say that, and it reminds me of Maria Montessori, who used to say, follow the child, right? That kind of idea of like, that's let the child guide you idea, you know, and that's a lot of what we were talking about. And I did want to mention the conference really quickly. I know we only have, looks like maybe a few minutes left. So AERO, one of the things that we do is we put on events every year. And we have what we call kind of our June conference, because it happens in June, usually every year, and it's happening June 23rd to the 25th, and it is going to be a hybrid event. So we're going to be in person at LIU Post in Brookville, New York, and then we're also going to have a virtual component. And so we have, you know, people from literally all over the world that either come in person or will join us virtually. And it's a mixture of youth and adults, so it's intergenerational. And we just, you know, we have just presentations, and I would really call them more sessions, on interactive sessions, talking about a lot of the ideas that we just talked about, but with people who are in the field, who have been doing, you know, working with, you know, learner-directed, self-directed education, people who have created their own, you know, their own schools or learning environments, and just, you know, youth that are doing some really incredible things. So it's really, and a lot of it is about networking, of course, you know, meeting people and connecting. And so it's really, it's a great event. We're going to be opening up registration very, very soon, probably within the next few days. And you could go. So there's the conference site is aeroconference.org, and then AERO's main site is educationrevolution.org. And when we say education revolution, some people say, hey, the revolution is happening right now, and I think so. I think there's that, but I think we really look at it again from the standpoint of, it has to be this idea of self-determination. And we look at that as like, that's kind of the main thing, learner directed, self-determinant. And that could look like, there's a lot of ways that can look, it's not just unschooling or homeschooling or whatever, there's just a lot of ways that it can look. And I think one of the unique things about AERO is that we're really one of the only organizations, and I would say the only global organization that I know of that has that idea, that inclusive sense of, okay, we're not just about, one thing, we're about this idea that can look in a lot of different ways and manifest in a lot of different ways. It could be Montessori, or it could be unschooling, it could be any of that. And what we really try to promote too is, again, this democratic process, right? The idea of self-direction, self-determination within a democratic process, to say, how do we make these decisions? And if we're not making them collectively, then what's happening, and why aren't we doing it collectively? And where's that coming from, and what's that about? And is that really the best way to do it? So the conference again is in June 23rd and 25th. Anybody could also contact me. My email is peter@educationrevolution.org. So pretty easy to remember. And any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put all of that information in the show notes. So I will link the 2 websites you mentioned. I'll link your contact information, your LinkedIn profile, all of that, so anyone can get in touch with you and possibly register. I will be looking to into this event as well, because I should be around at that time, and I would love. So if you wanted to, you could just go also virtually as well. You can
yes. And so again, there's going to be some differences between virtual and in person. We can't make all the in-person sessions available virtually. But anybody who registers for in-person would actually have access to all the virtual stuff as well. So and of course, networking is different in person. I mean, we do a really good job of networking virtually. It's just different. I mean, as we all know, we've all been to probably now lots of virtual events. And so we know I'm not that you can't. I mean, yes, you can absolutely network virtually. It's a little different. And I think in person lends itself a little better to that. But again, we'd love to have anybody in any way you can show up, whether it's virtual or in person. We hope. I know that you said that you're interested. I hope that you can.
I mean, I'm not that far. I might be able to go in person too.
That would be great. That would be great, and maybe find some other folks to interview.
I would love to promote more of this different types of learning environments, because I think that also gives us, the whole purpose of why I started this podcast was not just to, poo-poo the system and say, here are all the problems. Let's have a complaining fest about it. But let's really come together and think of education in a different way. And what could we do little by little to make it better and make it more of a democratic process? Because all the values we hold, in our country should be seen in our schooling system, right? So all the things you've talked about are the values that we hold in a democracy. And so we can do it. I do have belief that we can, again, little by little, make these changes. You're not going to have this huge change overnight. It may take decades, but I think 100 years of it being the same way, and then the pandemic kind of being this opening of, it's not really working like this anymore long term. What can we start to do to make those changes for the future? I think it's doable. Absolutely. And this is a great resource. So this right here, this conference, what you're doing with AERO, I think will give people an actual place to start, and a visual, yes, this can look different. It's not just we're just talking about ideas. Absolutely. Thank you so much for being
Yeah,
on the
thank you.
show. That's
Thank you
great.
very much for having me on, and it was a real pleasure. And I look forward to chatting with you more. And
Yeah.
again, anyone who's listening, please feel free to contact me. More than happy to talk about any of this with you, answer any questions. And thank you so much, Jackie, for having me on. And have a wonderful rest of the day.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.